HOAs don't have the best reputation, so the legislature's a bit, leery of us. So they box us in on and make sure we're going to do it the right way. So it's a little bit harder than it has to be in my mind, but maybe we need that to keep everyone on the straight and narrow.
Most people are not equipped to understand the seemingly endless facets of an HOA. That's why we're here, to help you become uncommonly prepared to serve your HOA. Whether you're a board member or a manager, join us in the Uncommon Area.
Welcome to the Uncommon Area. I am Matthew Holbrook, and this episode is about electronic voting in homeowners associations. And coming back to the Uncommon Area is Dennis Burke, attorney with Fiore Racobs Powers, and he joins me in a discussion on this very important topic for homeowners associations. And Dennis and I have a good and enlightening conversation around what are the things that board members and managers need to be aware of with respect to voting in a homeowners association by an electronic method. And so I hope that you watch this episode, and I hope that it is helpful for you. Well, Dennis, thank you for joining us for another episode of the Uncommon Area. We are going to be talking about electronic voting in this episode. And maybe just to set the stage, there are changes in California that allow for electronic voting coming up. But also we are aware that there's electronic voting that happens in other states. So we're going to talk about what's happening in California, but then also apply it nationally where appropriate. But what is happening in California? Why are we having this conversation?
Well, as you know, in California, we have a very detailed and robust voting system that homeowner associations are required to follow, very statutorily driven. And as of January 1 of 2025, there's an amendment to take effect that will allow associations to utilize electronic voting as a method of conducting some homeowner association votes. Normally election of directors or CC&R amendments would be the big ones. And that is a new thing for California. A lot of my clients have been hoping to be able to use electronic voting rather than having to fill out a ballot and mail it in to some stranger somewhere. And why can't we just vote by email like I do for a lot of other organizations that I belong to? And I've had to tell them they aren't allowed to do that under California law. It's specifically prohibited. But as of January 1, 2025, it'll be open so that associations, if they take the steps they need to take, they can use this as an option. And that's going to be a good thing, certainly over the long term.
So what are the steps they need to take?
Well, the one big step is they need to amend their election and voting rules. So for homeowner associations in California since 2006, they've required to have election rules. And every couple of years, it seems every association's had to modify or amend their rules to deal with new statutory changes. And this is another example of this. But it's optional. So if a homeowners association wants to have the option of utilizing electronic voting, they need to amend their election rules to add essentially 7 specific provisions. And the new legislation tells us what those provisions are. You 1 or 2 page amendment to your election rules, slap them on, and now you're at a point where if you wanted to, you could hire an inspector of election that would conduct a vote using electronic balloting.
So this is starting with, for an HOA, they have to amend their rules, election rules, but I'm focusing on the word rule as opposed to CC&Rs or bylaws. So we're talking about a change that the board can make with a 30-day comment period from the homeowners? Correct.
That's the way we look at it. It doesn't require a membership vote to amend your CC&Rs or bylaws. The board can control the process on whether to, in essence, green light the option.
Are there any of those 7 provisions that are worth noting as concerns or elements that might create a problem or that we should be aware of?
Not particularly. There's features of how you decide to implement the voting that have definite consequences. So the 7 rules or 7 specific provisions, they have in them this concept that you're either going to have a default where everyone votes by electronic ballot and they can opt out of that and get their old written ballot. That's going to be one default method. Or the other default method is everyone's going to use a written ballot, but if you want to opt into electronic voting, you can do that. So the big consequence for the associations is which option you choose for a particular vote. And if you choose the option where electronic voting is going to be the default, then you're building in a new notice requirement in California that has to go out essentially 120 days prior to the vote.
Every single time?
If you're using this where electronic voting is the default, correct, every single time.
It's not just the first time you do it.
It's not just the first time, and it's a customized notice, which is unusual for voting notices because it has to be customized to each owner, and it has to specify what their method of voting is, if they've established a default already, whether it's electronic or written. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge.
Yes, if you have 500 units in your association or 5,000 units, you have to send out 500 or 5,000 separate notices.
Yes, you have to provide notice, and there's different ways to provide the notice. Hopefully somebody wants to do electronic voting is authorized electronic notice, so you're not doing mailings. Right. But owners could lock you into having to do a mailing. So that's one big consequence. It's not so much that you can do electronic voting, it's which method of electronic voting you use. And the other maybe consequence is that the electronic voting system has to meet certain standards. Like it has to generate a receipt. It has to provide a means to ensure that the person's name is not linked with how they voted. So you know the idea is it still needs to be secret. So the days of using a homeowner or a notary public or someone to run your elections, to be the inspector of elections, if you want to use electronic voting, that's going to be nigh impossible. You're going to be forced to use a professional. Now, I think that's a good thing. The industry is moving towards using professional inspectors of election, and that's to be encouraged. It gives people more faith in the process, and it's also a better process. But the inspectors of election will have to invest the time and money in the electronic voting system to make sure it meets the new statutory requirements.
So the inspectors of election would have to either purchase or develop their own platform to be able to comply with the California provisions for electronic voting.
Exactly, and I would envision that that's going to take care of also these new notice requirements. So ideally, if you are on a homeowner association board, you're just hiring the right vendor, and you're really not going to see much difference, except maybe in the cost of who you hire, because they'll have to do these new steps. But there's one significant potential savings has to do with sending out the text of amendment. So as you know, when you're going to amend your CC&Rs, amend and restate, you're sending out hundreds of pieces of paper, or maybe you're sending out 50 because you've double-sided it. But that's still a big mailing expense. If someone has agreed to vote electronically and you amended your rules to allow that, and you're going to use an electronic vote, you can now email the amended and restated CC&Rs to the owner. You won't have that mailing expense that you do under the current California statute.
Now, you mentioned a couple of minutes ago that it depends on which version of electronic voting. So there's multiple different options on how an association could go about that?
On what you do as the default. So you have to choose at the front, are we going to default that electronic balloting is going to be the default, or the old style written ballot?
Okay.
And when I first heard that electronic voting had been authorized, oh, that's wonderful. So I was envisioning the statute would be like one or two sentences, and it would say associations can use electronic voting instead of secret ballots, written secret ballots. Well, that wasn't the case. So we've got, a 5-page of legislation with a lot of new standards and a new rule requirements. It didn't have to be like that, but at least here in California, HOAs don't have the best reputation, so the legislature's a bit, leery of us, so they box us in on and make sure we're going to do it the right way. So it's a little bit harder than it has to be in my mind, but maybe we need that to keep everyone on the straight and narrow.
One of the provisions is that the vote cannot be tied back to the name of a homeowner. Yet at the same time, I would imagine there would have to be provisions to ensure that there's only one vote per address.
Yes, and those are the technical requirements that the inspector of election has to meet, and those are also set forth in the statute. There's 5 or 6 technical requirements. There's the receipt that we mentioned, and then, in some way to make sure that people aren't voting twice. We have the same language that's in the existing statute about the first ballot that's received counts and can't be revoked. So the idea is it's going to stop them. And an owner, in order to use electronic balloting, they're supposed to provide the association with a valid email address. So you should only have one email address per property. But you could see where things can get dicey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think this is probably one of those things that will have to get kind of worked out over maybe the first few years that it's implemented.
It will, and it's optional. So if you want to wait a year or two to see how it plays out, that's a perfectly good strategy. And we've talked about election rules here in California. Every association is required to have them since 2006. There's different ways you can add the electronic voting to your rules. You can come up with a whole brand new set of rules, or you amend them, or you redline them. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it, and we'll have to see how that happens over the years. I think right now most places are amending, but that's going to be, I would prefer to do a new document, because you've had 3 or 4 amendments already to most sets of election rules, so maybe it's time to come up with something new and clean. And we've learned a lot over the years about what needs to be in the rules and what doesn't. So some of what I was putting in rules in 2006, you could take those provisions out, no problem, and make it a better document.
And there are other states that have already adopted electronic voting, and so I would imagine that there's got to be some learning from what's worked and hasn't worked.
Yeah, and I suspect that's where we got some of the statutory requirements as to the electronic voting system standards. And yes, it's my understanding other states have allowed electronic voting, and that's been widely utilized, and they've been kind of looking down on us people here in California.
Well, a little bit slow to that. Yeah. Well, I would also expect that this is going to result in much faster results of the voting tabulation on election night. Am I being overly optimistic?
Well, no, it certainly has the potential. And eventually, when everyone starts to use electronic voting and when every owner starts to use electronic voting, yes, it will be much faster. But right now, people are going to be able to opt in and opt out. Not everyone has an email address still. Not everyone's comfortable providing the inspector or the association with an email address. So we're still going to have a hodgepodge. So it will be quicker. And then I think as people get used to it, so remember 20 years ago when everyone hated those little satellite dishes that you put on the eaves of the roof. Now they're everywhere and you don't even notice them. Yeah. So maybe in 10 or 15 years, you won't have a problem providing an email address to the association, and all the voting will be done by email, and it'll just be second nature. Yeah. And that would be good. It would cut down on the cost, and it would certainly make things faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dennis, really appreciate your input on electronic voting in California, and I hope that is a helpful episode to anybody who's watching or listening, and I would encourage you to check out other episodes of The Uncommon Area.